Why did they think they could take it from me? Why did they believe I would just stand there and hand it over? The dock was more than wood and nails. It was years of sweat, mornings heavy with fog, nights when the moonlight danced across the lake. It was the place where I taught my kids to cast their first line, where my father sat with me in silence after Mom passed, where my heart learned the rhythm of water. And yet, one morning, tucked inside a crisp white envelope, came a letter with bold, careless words. The HOA demanded ownership of my dock. They said it belonged to the community, that my family's history meant nothing, that paperwork outweighed memory. I remember my hands trembling as I read the letter by the window. The sunlight broke through the blinds, slicing across the words as if even the day itself was trying to cut them out of existence. My wife looked at me, her brow furrowed, waiting for me to speak. But I couldn't, not yet. Because the anger burned too hot to put into words. For weeks I had stayed quiet when the HOA nitpicked every detail, the color of my shutters, the length of my grass, the way I parked my truck just a little too close to the curb. I swallowed those small indignities because I told myself they weren't worth the fight. But this was different. The dock wasn't some decoration. It wasn't a paint shade or a flower bed. It was a piece of me, and they thought they could take it just because they wanted to. I stood there in the kitchen, letter shaking in my grip, and my daughter asked, "Dad, are they really going to take it away?" I couldn't answer her then, not honestly, because the truth was I didn't know. That night I sat on the end of the dock, my legs dangling over the water, the reflection of the stars breaking into ripples with every small wave. I closed my eyes and let the cool air settle into me. That's when a thought pierced through the haze of anger and fear. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know that every waterway in this county, every lake, every stream, every dock passed through my office. That I had spent years studying, regulating, and protecting these waters. That the very laws they were trying to twist were the same laws I had sworn to uphold. The irony nearly made me laugh, nearly. But this wasn't funny. It was war. I didn't storm into the next HOA meeting like some Avenger. No, I played it calm. That's the thing about water. It looks still, quiet, reflective, until the current underneath drags you where you least expect. When I walked into that room, the president of the HOA sat there with her perfect posture, her clipboard resting like a weapon across her lap. She smiled at me, thin and practiced, the kind of smile that hides sharp edges. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "we've reviewed your property and dock. As per the association's bylaws, it falls under community ownership. We'll need you to sign the transfer of rights." The room was silent, neighbors watching with uneasy eyes. Some whispered, some looked away. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, and let the silence stretch. "Are you sure," I said slowly, "you want to claim that dock?" Her smile faltered, just a crack, but I saw it. Because I knew something she didn't. And though I could have revealed it right then, could have shattered their entire plan in a single breath, I didn't. Not yet. Because sometimes, letting them believe they've won makes the truth hit harder when it finally comes crashing down. So I sat back, folded my hands, and simply said, "I'll think about it." The room exhaled as if I'd given in. They thought the fight was already over. But what they didn't realize was that the fight had only just begun. And beneath the calm surface, the current was moving fast. Have you ever watched people celebrate too early, not realizing the storm that's about to hit them? That's exactly what happened after that meeting. The HOA walked out smiling, whispering, already planning how they'd beautify the lakefront once they controlled my dock. They thought I was finished. They thought silence meant surrender. But silence can be strategy. At home, my wife sat across from me at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "Why didn't you tell them? Why didn't you show them who you are?" I looked at her, my voice low. Because the strongest move isn't throwing every card on the table, it's letting them play theirs first. She didn't answer right away, just gave me that look, the one that said she trusted me but hated the waiting. And I couldn't blame her. Waiting was hard. especially when the dock sat just outside our window, carrying the weight of every memory we ever built there. The following week, notices started appearing, bright orange papers taped to the posts at the dock. Violation, unauthorized structure, pending removal. Each sign felt like a slap, not just to me, to my whole family. My son asked if they'd tear it down while we were sleeping. My daughter refused to sit out there anymore, afraid the HOA board might show up and push us off. That was the moment my anger shifted into resolve. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about them, my family, my neighbors who whispered that they were next, the quiet ones who lived in fear of letters and fines. So I went to work. Most people don't know what happens behind the county's closed doors. They don't realize the layers of permits, the regulations, the historical protections that shield waterways. They see a dock and think it's just wood. I see a dock and think jurisdiction, riparian rights, precedents in law. Every evening after work, I pulled files, drafted notes, pieced together the history of that shoreline. I traced ownership back decades. My grandfather's signature on a faded permit. A clause in a county record that no HOA bylaw could touch. Every detail became a weapon. But I didn't move quickly. I let them believe their plan was working. I let the neighbors talk, rumors spreading like ripples across the lake. I let the HOA stack their arguments, confident, smug. Until the day they sent me the final notice. That morning, I found the envelope taped to my door, heavy with arrogance. Inside was a date, the day they would take official possession of the dock. The words dripped with authority, with certainty. I smiled, because what they didn't realize was that by setting a date, they had given me the stage. The next HOA meeting was packed. Chairs scraped against the floor, the air buzzing with curiosity. Some came for drama, others for answers. The board sat at the front like judges, the president's chin tilted just a little too high. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I held up the notice and said, "You've made a mistake." The room hushed. I laid out the documents one by one, permits older than the HOA itself, county maps marked with boundaries they had no right to cross, legal statutes protecting structures tied to public waterways. My voice was calm, but every sentence landed heavy, like stones dropping into water. I didn't reveal everything that night. No, just enough to make them shift in their seats, just enough to remind them that not every homeowner is powerless. When I finished, the president forced another thin smile. "We'll review this," she said, but the crack in her voice betrayed her. I walked out without another word. The neighbors' eyes followed me, some wide with relief, others burning with hope. For the first time, the fear wasn't just mine to carry. That night, I returned to the dock. I sat where I always did, letting the water rock gently against the posts, and I thought about what had just begun. Because this wasn't over. The HOA had pushed me into a fight, but they didn't realize I'd been trained my entire life for this battlefield. And I wasn't backing down. What do you do when people mistake patience for weakness? That's what they did. The HOA board thought my measured words meant I was bluffing. They thought the calm in my voice was hesitation, not confidence, and that miscalculation would be their undoing. Days after the meeting, I noticed their next move. A surveyor walked down to the dock, clipboard in hand, reflective vest catching the morning light. He measured, photographed, muttered to himself. My wife watched from the porch, anger tightening her face. "They're trying to corner us," she whispered. But I didn't stop him, not yet. I let him take every photo, every note. Because I knew something he didn't. The more evidence they gathered, the more they tangled themselves in regulations they didn't understand. Later that night, I received an email from the HOA president. Polite words wrapped around cold intent. She said the community appreciated my passion, but that rules were rules, and enforcement was not personal. That line stuck with me, not personal. But tell me this, when someone comes for the place your father's hands built, the place where your children grew, how could it be anything but personal? Still, I stayed quiet. Until one afternoon when I overheard two neighbors talking near the street. They didn't know I was listening. One whispered, "If they can take his dock, they can take my shed." The other sighed, "We don't stand a chance against them." That broke something in me, not in a way that left me weak, but in a way that sharpened my resolve. This wasn't just about wood over water. This was about fear, about power, about people made to feel small in their own homes. So I called an old friend. Mike had been my mentor when I first started working with the county. He'd retired now, but his memory was sharp, his knowledge of waterways unmatched. I asked him to meet me at the dock. When he arrived, his boots thudded against the boards, the sound steady, reassuring. He ran his hand along the railing, nodding slowly. "Sturdy work. How long they been bothering you?" "Too long," I said. He looked me in the eye. "Then it's time to remind them what water remembers." That phrase stayed with me, what water remembers. Together, we dug deeper. Old county ordinances, grandfathered rights, historic maps that showed the dock had existed longer than the HOA's bylaws. We found a loophole so wide, it wasn't even a loophole, it was a highway. But still, I didn't reveal it, not yet, because timing matters more than truth. Release it too soon and it's ignored. Hold it just long enough and it becomes undeniable. The day came when the HOA scheduled their final enforcement. They posted it on the community board, a date when they'd bring contractors to seize and dismantle my dock. They wanted everyone to see. They wanted everyone to watch me lose. That night I sat on the dock with my daughter beside me. She dangled her feet in the water, quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Dad, why don't you just tell them, show them everything?" I looked at her, the starlight reflecting in her eyes. Because sometimes the lesson only sticks if they think they've already won. Only then will the truth sink deep enough. She frowned, not fully understanding, but one day I knew she would. On the morning of the so-called enforcement, trucks rolled into the neighborhood. Neighbors gathered on porches, some with worry, some with curiosity. The HOA board stood tall, clipboards ready, the president's lips curved into that familiar, smug smile. They walked toward my dock like conquerors claiming land. And that's when I stepped forward. I wasn't angry, I wasn't loud. I was calm, the kind of calm that makes people uneasy because they don't know what's coming next. "Before you touch that dock," I said, holding up a thick folder, "you should know something." The crowd stilled, the workers glanced at one another. I opened the folder, the papers crisp, undeniable. "This dock isn't yours to claim, it never was. County law recognizes riparian rights predating your association. This structure is protected by ordinances you don't even have the authority to challenge. And every action you've taken to seize it, documented, recorded, ready to be filed." The president's face drained of color. She tried to speak, but no words came. And in that silence, the neighbors saw the truth. They saw the HOA not as powerful rulers, but as bullies caught in their own trap. The workers hesitated. No one moved, the crowd murmured. And in that moment, standing firm on the dock my family built, I felt something shift. The fear that had weighed on this neighborhood cracked. Because sometimes, all it takes is one stand, one refusal to bow, to remind everyone else that power doesn't always belong to the loudest voice. Sometimes it belongs to the one willing to wait and strike when the time is right. Have you ever seen a room full of people realize, all at once, that the story they believed was a lie? That's what happened on the day of the enforcement. The board stood frozen. The workers shifted nervously, not sure whether to pick up their tools or walk away. And the neighbors leaned in, their eyes wide, their whispers sharp. They'd been waiting for someone to stand up to the HOA, and in that moment they saw it unfold. The president cleared her throat, struggling to steady her voice. "We'll take this under review." The words sounded hollow. Everyone knew what they meant, retreat. But I didn't celebrate, not yet. Because when power feels threatened, it doesn't crumble gracefully. It claws back. It finds shadows to hide in, angles to twist. That night I sat alone on the dock, the lake black and still under the moon. My wife joined me, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You shook them," she whispered. "Not enough," I said. "They'll try something else." And I was right. The letters started again, accusations that I'd been hostile, that I'd intimidated board members, that my dock was a safety hazard. They weren't fighting me with laws anymore. They were fighting me with words, with fear, with reputation. Neighbors who had clapped for me at the meeting now kept their distance, afraid of being dragged into the fight. The HOA had shifted the game. If they couldn't take my dock legally, they'd try to turn the community against me. I won't lie, that part hurt. Because when you fight, you expect enemies, but it stings when friends start to look away. One evening, as I walked back from the mailbox, I caught two board members standing by their car, whispering. I only heard a fragment. We'll make him wish he never. Then they noticed me, cut themselves off, and drove away. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Was I doing the right thing? Was I dragging my family into something bigger than us? And then in the quiet of that sleepless night, I heard my father's voice in my memory. Calm, steady. A lesson he'd given me years ago while we sat on this very dock. Son, he'd said, the river never wins by rushing. It wins by persistence. It wears down stone not with force but with time. Those words anchored me. I realized then I couldn't just defend myself. I had to expose them. I had to show the entire neighborhood what the HOA was really doing. So I started digging deeper, not just into water rights, but into the HOA itself. Financial records, meeting minutes, hidden fees slipped into budgets, fines issued without cause, patterns that, when pieced together, painted a picture darker than anyone suspected. The HOA wasn't just after my dock. They were building a system of control, one violation at a time. And the more I uncovered, the more I saw the cracks forming. Neighbors whispered to me quietly, cautiously. They fined me for leaving a bike in the driveway. They threatened to tow my car. They told me I couldn't put up Christmas lights. Fear lived in every corner of the neighborhood. But fear is fragile. Once you shine a light on it, it starts to shrink. So I decided to bring that light. At the next community gathering, I stood up again. I laid out not just my documents, but theirs, proof of overreach, evidence of misuse, patterns of intimidation. The board tried to cut me off, tried to shout me down, but neighbors leaned forward, listening. Their eyes widened as the puzzle pieces clicked together, and in those faces I saw something change. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was anger. Anger that had been bottled up for too long. When I finished, the room didn't erupt into applause. No, it was quieter than that. A silence heavy with realization. The kind of silence that means there's no going back. The president's smile was gone. Her hands trembled as she gathered her papers. She muttered something about misinterpretation and out of context, but no one believed her. That night, neighbors came to my door, quiet knocks, hushed voices. Thank you, they said. You spoke what we couldn't. And I realized the fight had shifted. It wasn't just about my dock anymore. It was about every family on this street, every homeowner who'd been made to feel small. The HOA had tried to isolate me, but in their arrogance, they'd given me something stronger than anger. They'd given me a community ready to rise. Have you ever felt the air shift, when people realize the ones they feared aren't invincible? That was the feeling after that gathering. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't just whispering, they were questioning. Watching the board with narrowed eyes, doubt was spreading like cracks in glass. But cracks are dangerous. They don't just weaken what's above you, they make what's beneath you quake. And the HOA knew it. So they struck back. The next week I came home to find a letter nailed, yes, nailed to my front door. Emergency violation review. Words sharp, final, dripping with manufactured authority. They accused me of harassment, of endangering community harmony, of inciting hostility against leadership. It was a threat dressed as procedure. My wife ripped it down, her hands shaking. They can't get away with this, she said, but her voice cracked because the truth was they were getting away with it. Neighbors who had thanked me in private still kept their heads down in public. They wanted change, yes, but they didn't want the fight, and the board knew how to exploit that fear. Rumors started swirling. At the store, at church, at the school drop-off line, I heard whispers, "He's just stirring up trouble." They say he's trying to take down the HOA. You know how these things go, better not get involved. And I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting. Because when you stand up, you expect resistance. But you don't expect your own community to look at you with suspicion. One night my son asked me the question I'd been avoiding. "Dad, are we the bad guys?" I froze. I looked at him, his young face, his worried eyes, and my chest ached. "No," I said firmly. "We're not the bad guys. We're the ones who refuse to be pushed around. And sometimes people confuse that with troublemaking." He nodded slowly, not fully convinced. And in that moment I realized this battle wasn't just about laws or docks. It was about teaching my kids what it means to stand, even when it costs you, even when it hurts. The HOA escalated again. They sent me fines, absurd ones. Hundreds of dollars for grass too long, though I'd cut it that morning. Citations for unauthorized exterior lighting, though the lights had been there for years. It was financial warfare, death by paper cuts. But I documented everything. Every fine, every notice, every contradiction. I wasn't just fighting back, I was building a case. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was shifting, quietly. One evening, Mrs. Hand from 3 houses down knocked on my door. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "They fined me for hanging laundry, said it lowered property values. I can't afford to pay." Behind her, Mr. admitted they threatened to tow his car for parking in front of his own house. One by one they came. Stories of humiliation, of intimidation, of money drained away in silence. And something inside me hardened. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't even just about my dock. This was about power unchecked. A board that thought authority gave them the right to trample dignity. The next community meeting was different. The room felt heavier. The board tried to open with business-as-usual pleasantries, but the crowd wasn't buying it. You could feel the tension crackling in the air. I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I'm not here tonight just for my dock," I said. "I'm here for every single person in this room who's been threatened, fined, or silenced. I'm here because fear has lived too long in this neighborhood, and it ends now." Murmurs rippled across the crowd. The board tried to interrupt, but people shushed them. Then I pulled out the stack of papers I'd been collecting. Fines, notices, letters. I read them aloud, one after another. Each one a mirror held up to their abuse, each one striking harder than the last. By the time I finished, the room wasn't silent, it was restless. People shifting, glaring at the board, whispering fiercely to each other. And for the first time, the board looked small. But here's the thing about small animals cornered in the dark. They bite the hardest. I knew they weren't done. They would strike again. And the next move would be the most dangerous yet. What happens when the people who claim to protect your home threaten to take it away? That was the card the HOA played next. One morning, I opened the mailbox and found a thick envelope stamped with legal lettering. My stomach dropped before I even tore it open. Inside was a notice. They were filing a lien against my property. My house, my family's home. They weren't just after my dock anymore. They were after everything. I stood frozen on the porch, letter shaking in my hands, while the neighborhood carried on like any other day, dogs barking, sprinklers ticking, kids pedaling bikes down the street. And yet, for me, the world had shifted. My wife came outside, saw the look on my face, and didn't even need to ask. She took the papers from my hand, scanned them, and whispered, "They can't, they would," but the fear in her eyes betrayed her. That night, the house was too quiet. My kids tiptoed around, sensing something was wrong. My wife sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, and I sat across from her, the notice spread between us like a wound. "This is their last move," I said finally. "They're trying to break us." She looked up at me, tears pooling. "And what if it works?" I had no answer. Because the truth was, I felt the cracks forming inside me. I'd fought, I'd stood tall, but now the cost was higher than I'd ever imagined. The dock I could lose, my pride I could swallow, But my home, my children's safe place, that was different. For the first time, I wondered if they'd won. The days that followed were heavy. Neighbors still whispered support, but whispers don't stop liens. Friends offered kind words, but kind words don't fight in court. And everywhere I turned, the HOA smiled their thin smiles, smug, certain. At night, I walked the dock alone. The water that once brought me peace now mocked me with its stillness. My father's words echoed, the river wins with time, not force, but time was what I didn't have. And then, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Hen knocked on my door again. This time she wasn't trembling, she was furious. "They find me again," she said, shoving a letter into my hands. "For a plant pot, enough is enough." Behind her stood Mr., his jaw clenched. They threatened my wife for hanging a holiday banner. One by one, more neighbors arrived. Some with papers, some with stories, all with anger. They filled my living room, voices overlapping, frustration boiling. And as I looked around at their faces, something inside me shifted. I realized this wasn't my burden anymore. It was ours. That night, we formed a plan. If the board wanted to fight me alone, I'd bring the entire neighborhood. If they wanted to play legal games, we'd hit them with something stronger: numbers, voices, truth. But before we could strike back, the board tried to tighten the noose. The lien notice wasn't just paperwork. It came with a deadline. If I didn't comply, they'd pursue foreclosure proceedings. The word itself made me feel hollow. Foreclosure. Losing not just the dock, not just the house, but the very ground my children had grown up on. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table with the papers spread out, the clock ticking loudly in the silence. My wife joined me, placing her hand on mine. "You're not alone," she whispered. Her words steadied me. The next morning, I went to the county office. My badge, my position, my years of service, they weren't just titles. They were tools, tools I'd earned, tools the HOA had never expected me to use. I spent hours digging through statutes, cross-referencing regulations, pulling every precedent I could find. And with each page, I felt the weight lift piece by piece. Because buried in the law was the truth. The HOA's lien was invalid, illegal. Their authority stopped where the water began, and my dock, my family's dock, had protections they couldn't touch. But I didn't rush back to reveal it. No, I waited. Because the board had already scheduled their foreclosure announcement for the next community meeting. They wanted a spectacle, a public humiliation. So I let them plan it. I let them bask in their false victory. I let them sharpen the blade. And then when the night came, I'd take it from their hands and turn it back on them. Have you ever watched people realize all at once that the world they thought was safe was built on lies? That was the room I walked into that night. The so-called foreclosure meeting was packed. Chairs squeezed together, neighbors craning their necks, the HOA board perched at the front like kings on a stage. Their smiles were wide, but there was an edge of nervousness creeping in. They could sense something, though they didn't yet know what. I held my folder tightly, the papers inside a weapon made of law, history, and truth. I had rehearsed this moment over and over, but nothing could prepare me for the electricity in the air. The president started the meeting with her practiced tone. "Tonight, we address ongoing violations and the pending lien on Mr. Dalton's property." Her words were smooth, confident, too confident. I waited. I let the silence stretch. I let the neighbors lean in, some curious, some fearful, and then slowly I spoke. "Before you proceed," I said, voice calm but firm, "there's something everyone in this room needs to see." I opened the folder, letting the papers fan out across the table. "These documents show that the lien filed against my property is illegal. Every fine, every notice, every attempt to seize my dock, it violates county ordinances, riparian rights, and decades of established law. And the dock itself has been legally protected since before your HOA even existed." I let that hang in the air. The president's smile faltered. That can't be." But it was. I went through the documents carefully, page by page, historic permits, survey maps, legal precedents. Every word landed like a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading through the room. Neighbors whispered, some gasped, some shook their heads in disbelief. "This isn't just about my dock," I continued. "It's about every family here who's been silenced, fined, or intimidated. This board has abused its power, hidden behind rules they don't even have the authority to enforce." I looked up, eyes met eyes across the room. Fear, surprise, even shame flickered on the faces of the board members, their arrogance, their certainty evaporating under the weight of truth. Then I turned to the neighbors. "And now you know what's been happening behind your backs, and now you have a choice. Do you let this continue, or do you stand for what's right?" Silence, and then one by one hands went up. A murmur rose, neighbors sharing stories they'd been too afraid to speak aloud. Fines for minor landscaping, threats for holiday decorations, intimidation for parking on their own driveways. The room transformed. It was no longer just a meeting, it was a reckoning. The president tried to interject, but her words fell flat. The crowd was no longer hers. The room had shifted. Power had moved from the board to the people. I laid down the final document, a county-issued statement confirming the dock's protection. "This is not just my victory," I said. "This is all of ours, and let it be clear, no board, no letter, no threat will ever take that from us again." Some neighbors cheered quietly, others nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Relief, pride, and a long-buried hope filled the room. The president slumped in her chair. The HOA's plan had collapsed completely, their authority stripped bare in front of everyone they thought they controlled. As I left that night, my family waiting outside, I glanced back at the room. Neighbors lingering in small groups, talking quietly, their faces alive with a new courage. The board trying to salvage dignity but failing. I realized then the dock had never been the prize. The dock had been the spark. And the fire it ignited, that was unstoppable. That night, sitting on the dock with my children beside me, the moonlight catching the ripples of the water, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. We had faced fear, intimidation, and betrayal. We had watched the people we trusted attempt to wield power over us unfairly, and we had stood. The water lapped gently against the posts, and I thought of my father's words again. The river wins with time, not force. Tonight the river had won. And so had we. Have you ever felt the quiet after a storm? The way the world seems to hold its breath, waiting for life to return to its rhythm. That was the lake the morning after the HOA's collapse. The dock stood unchanged, proud and steady, reflecting the early sunlight in ribbons across the water. My children ran along its edge, laughing as if the weight of the past months had never existed. I watched them, heart swelling, and realized something I hadn't fully understood during the fight. Victory isn't just about winning. It's about reclaiming what fear tried to steal. The neighborhood began to change almost immediately. Letters demanding fines stopped. Notices of violations disappeared. The board, humbled and stripped of authority, retreated quietly, their power gone not because of anger or revenge, but because the truth could not be ignored. Neighbors greeted each other differently now. There was a lightness in their steps, a quiet pride that had been buried under months of intimidation. Conversations once hushed were now open, filled with laughter and shared memories. People who had been afraid to speak up found courage in the smallest acts, planting flowers, hanging decorations, inviting each other over without fear of reprisal. One afternoon, Mrs. Hand came by, holding a basket of freshly baked bread. "For you," she said simply, smiling. "You reminded us all what it means to stand for something." Mr. stopped by too, leaning on the railing of my dock. "You didn't just save your family," he said. "You saved us all from living in fear." And I realized that the dock, the battles, the long nights of fear and strategy, they weren't about wood or rules. They were about dignity, about courage, about teaching my children and my neighbors that standing up for what's right matters, even when the world seems against you. That night I sat alone on the dock, the water calm, the stars reflecting like scattered diamonds. I thought about every step we had taken, the letters, the meetings, the arguments, the moments of doubt and exhaustion. And I felt something unexpected, gratitude. Not just for the victory, but for the struggle itself. for the lessons it forced upon me and my family, for the resilience it awakened in the community. I remembered my father's voice again, echoing from years past. The river wins with time, not force. And I understood now that this was true not only of water, but of life, of justice, of courage. Persistence matters more than speed. Patience matters more than anger. Quiet strength matters more than loud triumph. The dock no longer felt like just my own. It felt like a symbol, a shared place of history, struggle, and resilience. It was a reminder that power misused can be corrected, that truth has weight, and that communities can heal when someone chooses to stand for what is right. I thought about the neighbors who had been too afraid to speak at first, who now laughed with their children at the water's edge. I thought about my own children, who had learned that courage isn't always loud or immediate. Sometimes, it's a calm, steady refusal to give up. And for the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. The fight was over, the dock remained, the neighborhood had healed, and though the HOA still existed on paper, its shadow over us had been lifted. Sometimes life gives you trials that feel bigger than your strength, moments when fear threatens to consume you. And sometimes those trials show you what you and those around you are truly capable of. As the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the lake in gold and orange, I stood and looked out across the water. I felt pride, yes. Relief, yes, but also humility, because victory is never just about winning. It's about standing when it's hardest. It's about holding your ground when the world tries to move you. And in that quiet evening, with the gentle lap of the water against the dock and my family laughing behind me, I knew we had done exactly that. The dock still belonged to us. The water still carried our memories, and the neighborhood, our community, had remembered how to be brave. Sometimes the strongest battles don't end with triumph alone. They end with something deeper, respect, for the past, for each other, and most importantly, for yourself. And as I stepped back, letting the last rays of sunlight glint across the lake, I whispered to myself, this is what it feels like to win the right way.